Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Filtered webinar, PowerPoint Keeping Your Audience Engaged. The webinar will be led by Filtered Head of Content, Nick Fernando. But before I pass the controls over to Nick, just a few quick words about Filtered. We're an online training provider specialising in the use of adaptive technologies to personalise content, accelerating learning and reducing training time. Check out filtered.com to see our range of courses which can train your staff in key business and software skills. Follow us on Twitter with #FilteredWebinar to get updates, report back, or send us questions. If you have any questions for Nick during the webinar, please submit them into the chat pane during, and we'll answer as many of them as we can get through at the end of the session. If we don't manage to field your question, then please do email us afterwards at hello@filtered.com. Now I'd like to hand you over to Nick to get the webinar underway. Nick, over to you.
Hi everyone. And thanks, Alan, for the introduction. As Alan said, I'm the head of content for Filtered, and I'm going to be talking to you for the next 40 minutes or so about keeping your audience engaged when giving presentations in PowerPoint. Now, this could equally be a presentation about keeping your audience engaged using Keynote or Google Slides, because actually the contents of this presentation are focused on actual good presentation techniques. And so just to get that out of the way. And why do I think I'm a good person to talk to you about presentations? Well, I've been in the education and training field for about 15 years, and I have given a lot of presentations. And over that 15 years, that's been presentations in terms of delivering training, so presentations that involve trying to get people to learn from the content. I've given presentations to get funding for projects. I've given presentations on research that I've done and tried to get other researchers to digest my findings. And I've given presentations to senior staff in very large organizations, and also to promote our products and services here at Filtered and in previous organizations. So I've given a lot of presentations, but my presentation style at the beginning wasn't so great. You know, I was a young, enthusiastic man whose idea of great presentations were the ones that he saw in his lectures, which aren't probably the best examples of great presentations. And I adapted my style over time. I had training, I read a lot of books, and watched a lot of other people doing presentations. And so I picked up a lot. It's not something I figured out by myself. So, what is the purpose of a presentation? And my view, and I'm sure the view of others, is that the purpose of a presentation is to influence some sort of change in the audience that you're presenting to by communicating a key message. And that key message is really important. It's a singular major message. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's what we want to get our audience to take on board and get them to change in some way, whether that's change some behaviors, change by learning something, or change by getting them to take some action to support us with a project or buy our product or service. And so, as I said earlier, this presentation, and well, not this presentation, but all my presentations haven't been me figuring it all out by myself. Like I said, I had training, but I also read books by the top 3 listed individuals there, who have all written amazing books on presentation design and presentation delivery, and also there's some reference to Aristotle there, and that's primarily through his work on rhetoric and what factors facilitate influence and create a persuasive argument. So, in our presentation, we're going to be looking at 3 major components that work together to help you put together presentations that will keep your audience engaged. So, the first part is story, and in that we'll be looking at the components of a good story. And the next part is structure, and structure is about structuring your key message and the sub-messages into an argument, and therefore that will have an impact on the structure of your presentation. And then design. And in design, I'm going to cover a number of good slide and presentation design principles, but not the entirety of them. Well, I can't cover the entirety of how to put together a great presentation in 40 or 60 minutes. But hopefully I'll give you enough for you to have a look at your presentations, and maybe there might be some useful things for you which you can apply to future presentations that you design and deliver. So let's move on to the first part, which is story. And I would like to suggest that a good story needs three things. So a key message, or a major moral, a hero and a villain, and that doesn't have to be a codified hero and a villain, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And every good story needs a journey. So whether that's a personal journey or a journey like, you know, Frodo taking the ring to Mordor, every story needs a journey. So a story always has a key message it wants to communicate. So that key message is actually something that you will define and put together. It's what you want your audience to take away and do something about at the end of your presentation. And so to figure out your key message, what you really need to do is think about what is the one major thing. So what is that significant thing that I'm after from my audience, the thing that I want them to do, to take on board, whether that's change a behavior, learn something, support a proposal, think favorably of a product or service. So what is it that you want them to do at the end of your presentation, and why does that matter? So why does that matter to you, but why does it matter to them as well? Why does it matter to your audience? Because you've got to make it matter through your presentation in order for them to take that message on board, relate it to themselves and their experiences and their wants and needs, and take some sort of action. So you need to, before you even start putting your presentation together, have that really clear, because you're going to be relating back to that message through your presentation, and that helps in a number of ways. One, you present a coherent message across your presentation, and two, your audience doesn't lose track of what it is you want from them. So as I said a moment ago, every story has a hero and a villain, and that hero and villain don't necessarily need to be codified, as in like literally a hero and a villain. One way to obviously frame this is to think of the villain as the problem, the situation, the status quo that needs addressing, and the hero is the solution or the idea that you're presenting. And throughout your presentation, you want to kind of gradually build up the interplay between these two major characters, so the villain being the problem and the hero being your solution. So a story is a journey, as I said before, and so is a presentation. So in a presentation, you'll have a number of slides, you've got your key message, and you want to take your audience on a journey. So why is there this problem or this situation or the status quo, and what's going to happen, what needs to be done about it? So you're going to take them on that journey, and your presentation is doing that, and you need to be able to represent that in terms of the actual major narrative components, but also in terms of the structure, which we'll get onto in a little bit. So the obvious thing to say is that every story has a beginning, middle, and an end. Now that's patently obvious, and that's fine. But the key thing is to think about this in terms of a presentation. Is the beginning is the setup. So that's how you're defining the problem, situation, status quo, and linking that back to your key message. And then you're going to move on to the steps to deal with that problem or that situation. And then you're going, and the impact and the ramifications of that, and linking that back to your key message. And then you're moving on to the finale, which is where you're presenting or bringing to true light your hero, so your solution or your idea your product or service, whatever that might be. And linking that back to that key message as well. So throughout the journey, you're always linking back to that key message because it's that main key message that you want to get across to the audience. And you want to kind of make that clear because there's lots of scenarios where the audience may take different messages or different key messages from your presentation if you don't keep making it clear to them and reinforcing it so that everybody's on the same page about what they need to do at the end of your presentation. So once they've taken your key message on board. And so every presentation is a story, as I said. So you might as well make yours a good one. And to make it a good one, that requires some planning. And you can do this planning in PowerPoint, or you can do it offline with a notebook and a pen or a pencil. And I'm going to take you through Gar Reynolds, who's the guy who wrote Presentation Zen and runs the Presentation Zen website and blog, and used to work for Apple and was heavily involved in design and presentation design there too. And his approach is as follows. So once Gar has defined his key message and written that down, he then moves into a brainstorm. Now, none of this is really revelatory, but it's just good to sometimes go back over the obvious because it helps to frame it in terms of a presentation, because a presentation isn't really much different from coming up with a story or coming up with a good piece of design. So he then goes and brainstorms, and his brainstorming is the key message in the middle of the page or the top, and then all the different components that he wants to talk about that make up that key message. And he does that by kind of having his key message and then going down a level and splitting that into 3 main messages, and then going down another level and putting all the ideas. And then he groups those ideas together, and he will get rid of ones that don't really have a major impact in terms of getting that key message across. And then he'll storyboard them out. And storyboarding, literally you can draw boxes on a piece of paper, sketch in the information and content you want to present in your slides, and annotate them. But you can also do all of this in PowerPoint. So you could effectively do this in 2 ways. One way would be to have your key message on a slide, and then add text boxes with labels around that key message about the main points you think are important in getting that key message across, and that key message having an impact with the audience. And you can then just determine which ones are useful and which ones are not, transpose them into individual slides, switch up into slide sorter, and then start grouping those ideas together to come up with the major themes of your presentation, so the major story components. And then if you want to sort of storyboard it out, you can use PowerPoint to help you with that as well, because what you could do, and I know I do this because I'm really, 1, crap at drawing, and 2, very lazy, is I will create a PowerPoint file which has 3 blank slides, and then I will print it as a handout. So effectively what I get is 3 empty boxes with the lines for notes, and I print that out as many times as I want to, and then I start doodling away. So that's an approach to kind of setting out your key message and consolidating the main points and ideas that you have in getting that key message across, grouping them together into themes, and then storyboarding that out to see what content you could put into the actual slides. So just to summarize, a good story needs a key message. So that was that major thing that you want your audience to take on board and do something about, and making sure they're clear on why it matters to them, and also making sure you're clear on why it matters to you, of course. And then a good story needs a hero and a villain, the hero being the idea or the solution, and the villain being the problem, the situation, status quo, etc. And then setting that out as a journey. So you've got your scene setting, or the setup, where you're sort of talking a little bit about the problem and alluding to what might be a solution, going through the steps of dealing with that problem, and so further elaborating on what needs to be done to solve it, and then concluding by what will be the outcome, what will the hero have done at the end of the journey. So those are the story components. So that's us done with story. So let's move on to structure. So structuring your presentation requires having a compelling argument, and so you'll have the key message and the groupings, the major points, and the themes ready at this point. And now you're going to think about structuring that into a compelling argument. So how will you refine what you've done so far? It also requires being a star, and this might be very familiar to many of you, and I will elaborate on that in a moment. Otherwise, I'll sort of basically spoil the slide, so I'm cheating a bit here. And signposting the journey, so making, like I said, a presentation is a journey, just like a story, but with a presentation, you have lots of content, loads of content, and you're delivering it within a very tight time frame. You want to get that key message across, and so you need to do some signposting so that the audience knows where they are and where they're going and where they've been. And so we're gonna look at that as well. So a compelling argument needs to persuade, and the most effective persuasion involves the use of credibility, emotion, and facts. And we're going to sort of look at that in slightly more detail in the next slide. So Aristotle wrote about rhetoric and persuasion and set out that there are sort of three components, which I've just said, which is ethos, that's the credibility piece, pathos, which is emotion, and logos. And you know, in the ideal world, you'll have all three of those within your argument. So when you're looking at your presentation, the key message, the points that support that key message, you want to be looking at what elements of pathos and logos you can use to support that key message. And then the ethos piece comes down to you. And we're going to just look at that in the next slide. Whoops, I'm missing a slide. Oh, they've switched order, sorry. I'll have to jump back a slide in a sec. So going back to Aristotle and ethos, pathos, and logos. So ethos is all about credibility, and credibility is who you are. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have academic credentials or anything of the sort. You can communicate your credibility as to who you are by talking about your relationship with the problem and the solution, and that how that makes you suitable to talk about it and present it. And you can do that in a couple of ways. So you can sort of open your presentation with that, or you can have a slide in your presentation at the outset, setting out who you are and why you're there to talk about what you're talking about. And the pathos, which is the emotion, is all about impactful words and imagery, and using those to get an emotional response, but also that emotional response to connect to the points that you're trying to make to support that key message. And we'll look at that in a little bit, but one of the ways we can sort of frame that, well, there's two ways we can frame that, is I don't know how many of you have watched many TED Talks, but they are absolutely great. They employ all those three. We'll be looking at that in a moment. But also, if you look at any of the sort of old presentations of the late Steve Jobs, you can see he actually uses that quite a lot. And uses a number of impactful words and charged statements to support his argument. So when he's presenting a new product, you can see that in action. And then logos is fact, so the facts are the facts. They generally speak for themselves, although we do need to do a bit of work on that, and we'll talk about that in the design piece as well. And that's effectively you presenting data to support that key message and visualization, so that might be graphs or infographics, whatever that might be. So just jumping back, because I inadvertently dragged a slide when I was restructuring this presentation. So that was having a compelling argument, which required credibility, so who you are, pathos, which is emotion, and using emotion in terms of impactful words and images to get the audience to make a connection with your points and your key message, and logos, which is facts, and so using data and visualizations to support those facts, which in turn support your key message. Now, we're also going to talk about being a star, and star is, as you may have guessed, is actually used in competence-based interviewing. And we can use it in our presentations as well, because it fits very well with this idea of a story structure. And so having a setup and the steps and the finale, because STAR is effectively situation, task, action, and results. So, and we can see, going back to our sort of narrative structure, beginning, middle, and end, that actually fits really well. And it helps us as well. So rather than trying to come up with, oh, let's define this problem in a slightly abstract way, you can literally put down, well, what is the situation, or what was the situation, and describe it. What was the task that needed to be done, and the steps to do that task, and then what was the action, what is the action that needs to be taken, or the results that came about of the action being taken, and all the while linking that back to that key message. So coming back to an example, and I mentioned TED a short while ago, and if you watch any TED Talks, they're all really great. TED has a team of coaches that prepare and help speakers get ready to present and give them advice and guidance on their presentation styles, which is why you will generally see that there is a common theme in TED presentations, and they use that that notion of ethos, logos, and ethos, pathos, and logos really, really well. And so I'm going to talk about one example which I thought was, absolutely brilliant and really sort of is a great example for you guys, and do have a watch of this TED Talk, and you'll find that many of the TED Talks are very similar in their style. But this is a great one because the young man in the picture is 12 years old when he gave this presentation, I think in 2013. And his presentation was called How I Made Peace with Lions. The young man's name is Richard Terere. And this is how he went about having the ethos, pathos, and the logos. So the ethos, the credibility piece for a 12-year-old boy from Kenya, talking about how he made peace with lions, was that he lived in a local farming community. His family had a farm, and there was an issue where lions would wander from the reserve and attack their cattle, which is a bit of a disaster for a farming community. And his credibility, so that was why he was well suited to talk about it. But his credibility also came from the fact that he developed a device, for want of a better word, which actually prevented this from happening. And so that was the ethos piece. The pathos was Richard then used vivid imagery. So even on this slide where I've got the image from the TED Talk, you can see quite a striking piece of imagery behind him. And so he used very vivid imagery to actually convey this dilemma of, we've got, we're a small community, we depend on our cattle, the lions attack our cattle, and in retaliation, we kill the lion. So this is all very, very horrible. And so the pathos was generated by pulling on those emotional heartstrings to actually sort of set out and state clearly what the impact was, so kind of leading on to the logos of it. And the logos of it was sort of setting out and stating the impact, and also the process that he went through to develop his device to keep lions away so they wouldn't harm the cattle and in turn wouldn't get hunted down, and then the results of that. And so this was a 12-year-old boy who, growing up on a farm in Kenya, came all the way to the States and gave this presentation and delivered it using, his credibility, emotional messaging, and convincing facts. And so that's how this can fit together. And it's also a great example of the STAR technique because, like I said, they all these things that I've talked about fit very well together. So the situation, as I've described, the task was stop the lions from eating the cattle and getting killed in retaliation. The action was to develop some sort of device, and the result was he developed the device and it keeps the lions away and everybody's happy. And so we don't all have the luxury of, a team to coach us with presentations and stellar photography and imagery, and the fact that, a TED Talk is normally around 18 minutes and about 6 to 10 slides. We generally will want to present something which has a fairly substantial amount of content. And so when we're taking our audience on a journey, as well as kind of having to put that credibility, emotion, and fact across and connect that to our key message, we need to use signposting because there's just quite a bit of data in, quite a bit of content in our presentations. And so the signposting really helps to allow the audience to know where they are in the presentation, and it also contextualizes what's being presented and aids the recollection. So let's look at some examples of signposting because I've deliberately gone overboard with signposting, hence putting that statement at the end of the last slide saying lots of signposting. And so in this presentation so far, I've used some signposting. So the first thing was having those three stages and setting out what they were and doing that simply and effectively. I then, again, set out the contents of each stage and what would be covered. And then in each slide, I've got the actual part of the section that I'm talking about, the stage that I'm talking about. And I've also got the little three-stage smart art image in the corner to remind where we are. And then at the end of a section, I had a summary slide. Again, that's signposting and reinforcement, what was covered, and then also marking off what was covered and showing what we were going on to. And so signposting is really useful. I've used it a lot here. You don't have to use it as much, but you need to use it enough for the audience to keep track of where they are in the presentation. And make sure it's really simple and easy to follow, and it doesn't, otherwise it's going to start distracting from the content of your presentation and it can become clutter. And then finally, the amount of signposting you're going to need will vary substantially based on the size and complexity of your presentation. So I think this presentation is roughly 60 odd slides, and so that's pretty big, and I'm talking for quite a bit of time, and I've got quite a lot of things to cover, so I've used a lot of signposting, but then I've taken that a little bit further just to reinforce that because I was using it as a prop for coming up to this part of the presentation. So just to summarize, structuring your presentation requires a compelling argument, so that's where we looked at credibility, emotion and fact, and using those to support that key message that we're trying to get across to our audience in order to get them to do something at the end of our presentation. Being a star, so that's using situation, task, action, results to set out the flow and the structure of our presentation. And then signposting, which is where we're helping our audience keep track of where they are and be in step with us and with the message that we're trying to get across. So that's story and structure done. So then we'll move on to design. And there are a number of pieces that I'll cover in design. And I'm just going to be showing you, what I think is good practice and what I've read is good practice. And, from the training I've got, I'm not telling you this is the only way to do it, but hopefully that there are some useful things in here that you can take on board. So a good presentation design should focus on simplicity. So that means, keeping the focus of the audience on the actual content you're presenting, and keep distractions and clutter to a minimum. Keep your messages nice and focused and clear. Have a good signal to noise ratio. So what I mean by that is make sure that the point that you're trying to get across is the focus of the slide, and it's not hidden behind unnecessary noise, and we'll look at a couple of examples of that. And also be easy to follow. So, like I said, the presentations can be quite big and there is a lot of information, and for a proportion of your attendees, some of this information will be completely new. So you've got to take some action to make it easy for them to follow. And these three things will blend together, as you'll see in the coming slides. So for your message to have impact, your slides need to be simple and clear. And that means really, just presenting the most essential information that you want to get across and leaving out the rest. And there's ways that we can deal with the rest, which we'll cover. So here's an example of focusing on simplicity. So I've got a slide here, and this slide is talking about applying the 80-20 rule to your work. And, there's lots of useful information in here. So, there's lots of different tasks going on at work. Some of it's more useful. Only 20% of the work you do carries 80% of the value. So the converse is true, and so it's important to prioritize your work for that reason. So, lots of useful detail and explanation here, but it's a lot to take in. The slide's very text heavy. There's a lot of repetition in it, and what's the key message that the presenter is trying to get across? So if this was our slide, we'd probably just want to focus on that key message. A smaller proportion of your work carries most of the value, so focus on that and do something about the rest. And so that's exactly what we can do. We can bring that down to a single statement and still take forward most of that, most of the value of that point, and using some emphasis to sort of help that message at that point get home. And so, it doesn't take lots of work to do this. It just takes a bit of a little bit of restraint, I guess. So when we're putting our presentations together, so when you've done your planning and you've sketched out your storyboard and you've put the notes of what you want to get across, look at it and look at it very critically. Is all of this information absolutely essential? What is the key message that I want to get across? Because people aren't going to remember everything, so I need to really make sure that my points hit home, and then be ruthless with the content that you put on the slides. Don't get tempted to fill it up. The more detailed slide looks a lot more convincing, but it's also a lot harder to remember, especially if there were a whole series of slides on productivity, and that was a presentation on productivity. So noise in your slides can be thought of as clutter. So we've seen a type of clutter, which is having too much text on the slides and too many points, and that can detract from the message you're trying to get across, and we saw that. and it confuses your audience. So that's fine. We've looked at how it applies to text. Let's see an example of how we can reduce the noise in a slide that has a visualization. So I've got a slide here. This slide is about the number of hamburgers sold. So I want us all to imagine we are running a hamburger joint, and we've got together to sort of look at performance, but also try and understand a particular anomaly. And that anomaly is the month of May. In May, we sold a lot more hamburgers than we did in other months. And this chart, at least on the surface, gives us some useful information. So, you know, we can see all the months. Let's say we're in August now. You can see all the months running to July. We know that the blue bars represent the hamburgers sold in 2015. There are grid lines which can kind of help us figure out roughly what those numbers are. So there's a lot of detail in this slide. But if we think about what the purpose of the slide and the purpose of this visualization is, it's to kind of sort of put this anomaly, this anomalous month of May into context. So do we need all of this extraneous information? And actually it becomes noise because it sort of distracts. People might be trying to read what months, what amounts were sold in which months, and you know, why is there a bit of a dip between January and April, as well as why is there an anomaly in May. So what we can do is simplify this down to keep the focus, and that's what we should always aim to do with all sorts of visualizations. And so this is a simplification of it. It's still got that anomalous month. It's got the months either side. We've actually gotten rid of the axes and the grid lines, and we're just stating the months and the numbers sold, and we're putting an emphasis on the one that we want to focus on. And so you can do the same thing with your visualization. So and particularly if you create these in PowerPoint using the sort of inbuilt micro Excel editor, it's pretty easy to do this by changing the formatting settings, selecting an individual bar and changing the color. So we're going to talk a bit about pictures now, because again, this is another signal to noise factor, and also because it's a great opportunity for us to see how images can potentially create an emotive response. So we're going to be thinking about this in terms of the fact that images can help add context and add impact, but I would stress, and I generally try to avoid using images insofar as I can, and I'll explain why afterwards. But use them thoughtfully and use them wisely. So let's look at an example of using some images, or using an image to have some impact. So we're going to look at this in the context of something which can be a slightly painful topic, but is very true, and that's looking at the gender pay gap. And so in this particular slide, I have an image in the top right. I've got my main sort of content on the left of it. You can see that there is a table. First, that, you know, this is a study by the CMI showing that there is a pay gap as people get older in their career, and also the sort of level of responsibility grows. So I've got a table presenting that information. I've got this image on the top right. The image isn't really that relevant, and isn't, you know, it's not particularly relevant, and two, it's not going to really elicit any sort of emotional response. So maybe we can change that slightly, so we can, you know, actually have an image of a female and still have that data. But actually there's quite a lot of noise. So if we think back about the previous slide, so, you know, simplifying down, focusing on the key message, and trying to have that impact, we can actually take this further by actually using some imagery in the form of a photograph, and that's what we're going to do next. So we've got this sort of baseline information, which is that, you know, as people get older, you know, the pay gap between men and women gets bigger. And so how can we sort of present that in a more impactful and an emotive way? And so we can take an image, and you can see here I've sort of minimized down that data to focus on what the key message was from that study by the Chartered Management Institute. And I've got a professional lady working in a nice location. Now, that's pretty impactful. I put emphasis on the actual, you know, what the approximate difference is, and we can contextualize this because actually this is about other humans and other people, you know. So we want to have that impact. You know, why is it that women can get paid less for doing the same great work as men? And so we're using imagery here to create some emotion. However, there's a couple of minor things that I thought weren't so fantastic about putting this together when I did. The first is that this woman, she could be an entrepreneur, and so is her own boss and isn't impacted by this. But also the image actually has quite a bit of noise. So even though the entrepreneur professional lady is loud and clear, the focus is on her, and the background is nicely bokeh'd out, it actually introduces noise into the message I'm trying to get across, which is that, you know, this issue of, you know, even though the output is comparable, a professional woman can expect to get paid less than a professional male as they progress in their career and get older. So changing up the image somewhat can help with that. So here's a slightly more corporate look, because this was a study done by the CMI of mid to senior managers, and it's also less light-hearted. So, you know, there's a more serious tone to this. There is a better contrast in the background, so the message is very clear and it becomes a lot more readable. So that's an example of using imagery. Now, the thing that I wanted to come back to was I don't really tend to use too much imagery because it is actually quite time-consuming to get the right imagery and then apply some design principles to get your messages to stand out. So you may have noticed in this presentation I've been focused on clarity, you know, using just a couple of colors and primarily texts to get my messages across. But that's not to stop you from doing this, and if you are somebody who wants to create some very evocative slides and use images to help make your audience make an emotional connection, then by all means go for it. It does take a bit of time and effort though, and so that's why I tend to, well, it's kind of painting me as a lazy person, which is partially true, but also because it is very time consuming. So if you're putting together a high stakes presentation, then it's absolutely worth it. Or if you're putting together a presentation where you only need to use a handful of slides, it's absolutely worth it. Now, one thing in terms of that signal to noise ratio is to try to avoid using lots of animations and transitions, because they add noise. They also add a lot of overhead mentally for your audience. So your audience's brains and your own can assimilate information, take on board information using two channels, but those two channels are visual and sort of auditory verbal. But those channels have limited processing power. So the busier you make your slides with clutter and with animations and things moving that aren't absolutely necessary, the harder you're making it for them to take those points on and actually connect your points to your key message. So try to actually use as few of them as possible. You know, the temptation is that, you know, it's got all these great features in PowerPoint, you know, like great transitions, lovely animations, but really think carefully about that. The only sort of times I would use transitions is transitioning from one section to the next. So you may have seen that when I sort of get to the end and I tick one off, there is then a sort of wipe transition, which brings the next stage in my presentation into focus. And that's about as much as I've used transitions in this. An instance, a valid scenario where you might want to use animations is if you are trying to build up a complex visualization. But again, I would sort of urge you to think, do you really, really need a complex visualization to get? Is it absolutely essential? Is there a more simpler representation that you can use to get your point across? And so presentations can have a lot of content. So like I said, this presentation has got a lot of slides. We're covering a lot of stuff. We will make this slide deck available to you to go through at your leisure and convenience at the end of the webinar. But there is presentations can be very big, and it is hard to keep track of everything in them. And so we can do things to make it easier for our audience to keep track. So we've already talked about signposting, but another thing we can talk about, another thing I can talk about and that we can use to support our presentations and taking information on board is the rule of three. And the rule of three just stipulates that, people find it easier to remember things that are made up of no more than 3 pieces of information. And that helps us to take them on board more easily and more easily digest our presentation. So that applies across the board. So, with your key message, can you group it into 3 main themes, and then, in your slides, try and focus on a maximum of 3 pieces of information at a time, at the absolute most. And you've seen that a lot in this presentation. So my presentation has 3 main stages: story, structure, and design. Where I do have information on the slide, it's kept to an absolute maximum of 3 pieces. And that's really to sort of aid with helping the audience to take that on board. And so you can do the same. It's really tempting to sort of, what we saw with that Pareto principle slide, to put lots of information on there because it makes it seem more valid. But there are lots of other ways to actually get that information across and have it as valid, but being more efficient. And so this is one of the things to take on board and take with you for use in your presentations. Another thing is making sure that language is as simple and easy to understand as possible. Now, that's not always going to be possible, but if you put a little effort in, you can actually get a lot of mileage out of using simpler language. And a really great example of that is Steve Jobs talking about the iPod and saying, this thing stores 1,000 songs and fits in your pocket. He could have gone into all the specs and the details and the weight, and obviously all of that information is useful, but that can be provided in another way. He sort of focused on simple and easy to understand language for his audience because from Apple's point of view, they were presenting this totally new product, which actually was very different from what was on the market. And so they wanted to focus on making it easy for the people tuning into that presentation to understand what it was that they were presenting. And that kind of leads on nicely onto my next point, which is, slides aren't documents, so we shouldn't treat them like that. The slides are really sort of getting across those important points which relate to that key message that we're trying to get our audience to take on board and get them to do something with at the end. If you want to have lots of detail, put it into a handout, and a handout doesn't have to be a PowerPoint handout. You could put together a nice Word document which sets out all of the additional details, and that the audience can use as a reference either during the presentation if they want to dip into some detail because what's in the slide they feel they want to know more about, but also for them to take away and analyze. And so that's a really important thing to take on board, that with our presentation, we're standing up and we're talking, they're focusing on what we're saying, but also trying to keep track of what we're showing them behind us or wherever the slides are appearing. And that's quite a hard job, so let's make it easy for them to follow by stripping out that heavy detail, putting that into a handout, and focusing on our important points and communicating them nice and effectively and clearly and simply. And if you think that you might need to show some detail during your presentation, and I'm not advocating this, I always would say, put it into a handout. You can put it in a slide outside the flow of your presentation, and then use a PowerPoint action to jump to that detail. So let's look at an example of that. So we're coming back to this slide with the image, and you remember that it was tabulated and I condensed it down to this single statement to create some emotional impact. But if I wanted to go into the data, a PowerPoint action lets me jump to that data, and here I've sort of changed it to make it clearer. So if somebody asked me, well, is that 40% across the board, or is that 40% over time? I can jump into that data and show them. And then I've got another action which I've applied directly to this chart, which lets me click and go back into the flow of my presentation. And so, just to summarize, good presentation design should focus on simplicity, and that was a running theme through all the slides I've just presented in this stage of the presentation. Get rid of all that unnecessary detail, focus on getting your points across clearly and impactfully, and connecting so that they're connecting back to your key message and that your audience can keep up and not get confused, and making sure that that's easy to follow, so using things like the rule of three, and keeping detail, if detail is absolutely essential, in handouts or out of the flow of your presentation. And so that's design, and that brings us to the end of our presentation. And I hope you found that useful. And if you do have any questions, as Alan said at the beginning, feel free to drop them in. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, feel free to send us them directly. We'll happily answer them. So, yes.
Okay, Nick, yeah, we've got two questions actually that we can just field now. So the first one is from John, and John has asked, how long should a good presentation be? Is there any magic number of points to get across or slides to use?
How long should a presentation be? So I guess that's a kind of a, what is this size and scale of the message that you want to get across? Like, how complex is it? That's going to really determine everything else. But you've got to remember, the bigger your presentation, the more content there's going to be in there, the harder it's going to be for your audience to keep track of that key message. So, I know it's not really an answer because it's sort of a bit of a how long is a piece of string type question, but no longer than is needed to sort of get that key message across. So that's the first bit. And the second bit was about the number of
slides to use.
The number of slides to use? Well, that really depends on you. So a good sort of ballpark is that we've been talking for almost an hour, and I've used 60 slides. But if I sort of go into my slide deck, you'll see that I don't actually have any slide builds. So because I don't have any slide builds, I've kind of set everything out on individual slides, and also because I wanted to cover quite a lot, with that major key message of a presentation is to influence change in the audience, then we need to get that across. So I've ended up with about 60 odd slides. But if you put that into perspective, the average TED Talk has 6 to 10 slides, takes 18 minutes. So, if we used the TED calculation, then an hour-long presentation would have about 18 to 30 slides. So that should really sort of be a rough ballpark. There's no sort of hard and fast rule for it. It just really depends on your style. So I like to kind of have my slides moving along in a good flow, but that might not be essential. So some things which will determine the number of slides, again, going back to that key message, is, you break that up into a maximum of 3 stages, and then you look at the points that will support each stage, try and keep them to a maximum of 3, and then you'll see, how many slides roughly you need. So if we sort of went with the absolute minimum of 1 slide per thing, I'd have 1 slide for the key message, a slide each for the themes, so that's the 4 slides, and then under each theme I'd have 3 slides, so that's another 9 slides. So we're talking about, what, 14 or 15 slides at the absolute minimum.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And our other question is from Hermione, and that is, how would an accountant or other person responsible for budget set ethos, pathos, logos model to his or her presentation of budget to the board of directors? What's specific?
Right, okay. So I haven't had the opportunity to do that, so I can't really give you a 100% useful answer to that. However, if we think about what was in our presentation and thinking about data, the first thing is going back to that key message. So what is it you want? What's the major thing you want to get across to your audience, and what do you want them to do at the end of it? So if you're reporting figures back for them to determine business performance, then you just need to focus, well, not just, because that's easy for me to say, harder for you to do, but put the focus on what are the sort of major data points that are going to give them that detail, and try and keep everything else to the absolute minimum. So focus on setting that out as your key messages. And then in terms of ethos is your credibility. So you've pulled those figures together, or your teams pull those figures together. You're close to the data, so you should automatically carry the credibility to speak to the board about it. In terms of pathos with figures, now it's the same as sort of pathos with, we looked at an example there which was about gender pay. Now obviously that's a very powerful subject, but your report to the board can be equally emotive. So if you want to draw their attention to a restriction of cash flow, look at that in the context of what other sorts of projects and capital expenditure pieces they've got going on, how that might affect their ability to do that in the future. So you see hopefully where I'm going with this, but it's to really sort of focus on those, taking that data and connecting that to the message that you want to get across, and connecting it to the points you're trying to get across. If we don't have good cash flow and we don't have enough money in the bank, we aren't going to be doing these big change projects or transformations or anything. Or if we're doing really well, then maybe now's a good time to think about investment or whatever it is you're presenting with those figures.
Okay, lovely, Nick. That's all the questions that we have from our audience. So I suppose just leaves me to say thank you to you, Nick, for a fantastic presentation. Before I leave, I'd just like to mention a couple of things as well. Firstly, as Nick said, if you do have any further questions about the webinar or about Filtered in general, please do email us at hello@filtered.com. If you'd like to rewatch the webinar, you'll be able to find it on our website, www.learn.filtered.com/webinars, within around 24 to 48 hours, so you can probably check it tomorrow afternoon. If you're in London this week, then come and visit us at the Learning Technologies 2016 exhibition at London Olympia. Filtered will be on stand B14, and we'll also be presenting a seminar during day one with Towards Maturity, entitled 10 Insights for Engaging Learners at 12:30 p.m. At Lecture Theatre 4. That's everything from me, so on behalf of Filtered, thank you for joining us and have a great evening.